And my slides are in English. We are going to talk about NIV for those patients in which we cannot do just about anything. So I really like this paper from ERS Task Force about end-of-life decision-making in respiratory intermediate care units. So this type of NIV can be found in two instances in cases where the patient cannot be intubated, either because NIV will be brought to him or her because we hope he will survive, or because we believe that NIV in someone who is in respiratory distress at the end of his life will make it possible to reduce signs of distress. So this is a study in the literature which helped identify 10 studies over a period of 15 years with 450 patients. What we can say about these quantitative studies is that half of the patients do survive to NIV while there is no intubation, and this is something that is quite feasible. We have no qualitative data to say that if those patients who do not die in ICU will die later in downstream wards or in palliative care units, and we have no data either on long-term care about those patients. Now, in addition to the fact that this has been done, we have to make the difference between comfort measures only, which means those patients for whom we try to improve comfort. But there is also another group of patients where intentionality is important. We want the patient to survive, but we won't intubate the patient because the patient doesn't want to, and the whole of the medical team, on the basis of a consensus, believes that given the clinical situation, it is not possible. These are the results of the literature. This is a summary table. Well, I showed you a summary table, but as you can see here, mortality is much higher when patients are not intubated with a hypoxemic respiratory failure, while in COPD exacerbation, this is a very positive benefit to use palliative NIV. In acute pulmonary edema, it all depends on the cardiogenic situation, on the judgment criteria. In the short term, mortality is strongly improved in ICU, but for other patients, based on the situation, hospital mortality does not clearly show long-term benefits. These are other data from Providence which show exactly the same thing. So the key message is in this particular paper from the Ethics Committee of ACCM. Every single time you use NIV, well, you yourself, and you also have to explain to your teams and paramedical teams, you have to explain the objectives of the treatment. These objectives are either in category 1, most patients, the great majority of patients, we use NIV. If it doesn't work, we intubate. The idea is to avoid intubation and its complications, and the final objective being survival of the patient. So NIV first of all, and then if it doesn't work, of course, we won't let the patient become comatose, and so we'll use intubation. Category 2 is where we have to work on intention. We want to do our utmost for the patient. Antibiotics, all sorts of screening, examinations, and mechanical aspects as well for those patients who very often have COPD or a cancer. And for those patients, we're going to do our utmost, the objective being that they survive, they get rid of this ARF, but they won't be intubated, either because they told their GP or their specialist that they have already been intubated once or twice and they don't want to do that again, or because the team has considered that this was not adapted to the patient's prognosis or to his quality of life or comfort. And the third category is easy to understand. It's a patient who's dying, so we want to reduce acute respiratory distress through non-invasive ventilation. and some people do believe in it. So if you use NIV, your patient will be either full code, and you'll have to specify in details to your team. So you have to clarify that the patient, for example, is dependent, that there is no possibility to correct a number of situations, that the patient becomes shocked, and then there is a need for intubation. When we reach this situation, we move on to a purely palliative type of care, and here we are in palliative care in the third category, and we want to improve the comfort of the patient. So why moving on to palliative care? Because it is one of the very few non-invasive methods which has a strong correlation between saved life and therapeutical interventions. So this is a paper by Louis Orhan and Brochard, which shows the gases parameters, respiratory acidosis, and also physiological parameters that show that the respiratory work and indirect data showing reduction in respiratory distress, all these parameters are improved, and this is why we'll use NIV for those patients. So these data, when you translate them into a clinical situation, well, they make it possible to avoid complications, and this is why we want to try and use NIV even in extreme situations. 15 years ago, such extreme situations were quite frequent, but today we only have a 40% mortality rate in such cases. So this is a very good indication. And also for patients in cardiogenic states where, for which the data are still ambiguous. Now, type 3. Should we use NIV for those patients who are dying in order to reduce the hardship of this end-of-life process? So this is a question which I'm asking in such a way that it's impossible to answer. It's very difficult to measure the quality of life of such a patient, and our studies won't be able to provide an answer. But the only study that really targeted these patients was a multicentric trial by Michael Ferrer and colleagues in Spain and Taiwan on 200 solid tumors patients with a life expectancy of under 6 months with solid tumor life expectancy under 6 months and ARF. These patients were stratified on the basis of their PCAO2, and what we saw was that respiratory distress was much more reduced in those patients with an IV, and this is why those investigators decided to carry out a randomized trial in order to include more patients and to demonstrate a strong benefit. But they were faced with a major obstacle. There is no tool today to measure the quality of dying, as it were. In the situation, the intermediate situation, the DNI patients, we've performed the OVNI study in France and Belgium. It includes a number of patients in order to have qualitative data on the way NIV is performed in ICUs and what are the data in terms of quality of life, of post-trauma stress, of anxiety, of stress in those people who did not die after palliative NIV of type 2, those patients who receive antibiotics and all sorts of treatment, everything that we know how to do in ICUs in order to make sure those patients survive. So how frequent is the use of palliative NIV in critically ill patients with acute respiratory failure? What are the goals of care, and what are the quantitative results in terms of number of patients who survive and the quality of life of those patients who survive? So 54 ICUs in France and Belgium follow-up up to day 90 and also up to 1 year. So Alexandre Moule was able, in the framework of this study, to make an epidemiological update on NIV data he presented last year. 1,450 ARF patients, 1,203 non-ARF MV patients, post-neurology surgery, for example, and 54% of those ARF patients used NIV, were given NIV, and Alexandre said that this was an increase compared to the past. Now, what about the percentage of use of palliative NIV in those categories 2 and 3? Well, what is surprising is that 1/4 of those patients with NIV will have a limited treatment prospect, and in 17% of cases, those are BNI patients, and in 9% of cases, these patients are dying patients for whom we use NIV in order to reduce acute distress symptoms. Out of those 25%, in those patients of category 3, they are never admitted into ICU specifically for that. They were admitted in ICU in categories 2 or 3, and then we've discussed the situation with their referring doctor, and we discussed NIV. We realized that when we stopped NIV, those people were very uncomfortable, and so they were in our services, in our wards, but they were not admitted specifically for this. So here you have the green columns that show, and the red columns show the palliative patients, and especially in those patients with cancer, COPD, with a hypercapnic exacerbation of their COPD. In yellow, 36% of patients were DNI when admitted. 60% of patients got this DNI status once in the ICU, and so they were received NIV, and then 4%, that's interesting too, had a status to decide therapeutical limitation, but the decision was reverted. So these decisions can go both ways. On this slide, you see mortality data, hospital mortality data in red, in group 3. It is the appropriate definition. Everybody dies except in the hypercapnic group where 2 patients survived and died later on in the other wards for one and in palliative care for the other. So these data are palliative data and show dying patients. For those patients, we are not in a position to measure the quality of dying. Now, let's look at category 1. As Alain said, this is not polluted with therapeutical limitations. For example, 7% of those patients who receive NIV will survive. In hypoxemia, 12%. It's more important in cancer, 28% mortality, and in pulmonary edema, it's 12%. So these are data that are not polluted by therapeutical limitations. And in yellow, you see that 56% of COPD patients who were given NIV will survive, and 56% will survive, will go back home, and the survival for the others is roughly around 50%. So this is confirmed in the literature. First of all, NIV in DNI patient is correlated with about 50% survival, with a little bit higher rate for COPD patients, and NIV today is the standard of care. Now, qualitative studies. Qualitative studies with phone conversations with patients and their families, 349 interviews. So here you have data on SF36 with the sub-scale, physical and mental sub-scales. You see that overall there's no difference between the 3 groups for mental scale before admission in ICU, because patients were able, well, almost all of them, some of them were comatose, but almost all of them were able to answer questions. And here you have patients with physical disturbance, which defines palliative care. So they don't always have the same quality of life. And these are data before ICU. After 90 days after discharge, every patient has died, and the quality of life, both in the physical and mental scales, can be superimposed, which means that survivors, those patients who survived, over half of them, well, had exactly the same quality of life as the one they had before going into ICU. So we don't discharge patients to extend their end-of-life process. Those patients really have a quality of life that is quite similar to what it was before they were admitted. Same results with the post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and so on. Now, as far as families are concerned, in those families where the patient died, there is an increase in PTSD. Of course, this is expected. But in groups 1 and 2, families do not suffer from any more depression symptoms or do not show any more PTSD in DNI survivors. So in summary, 1 of 4 NIV patients receive palliative NIV. Survival is quite substantial in terms of numbers. What is surprising in this study is that survivors after NIV with no intubation project have an altered quality of life, but in the same proportions than before ICU. We have patients who survive with the same quality of life as they had before. So NIV really helps people live normally. Symptoms of anxiety, depression, and stress are not increased in SCCM2 survivors. And for the families, the proportions are just about the same. There are a number of questions I didn't have any answer to. Should this NIV be carried out in ICU versus wards, in intermediate units or in wards? Should it be considered as a therapeutical trial? We saw that in hypercapnic patients. Palliative NIV, well, if it works, it should be continued, but if it doesn't work, it should not be imposed to patients with a larger mask. For example, should we find a new code status for those particular patients, because it's not really NIV, it's NIV in DNI patients. Should we reserve this situation to patients who have home NIV with a higher proportion of success? Should we exclude cancer patients? I have no answer to these questions. A number of trials are ongoing for each of these questions. In hematology, for example, there's a German and Italian trial that are ongoing. Italians are quite familiar with NIV and also with transversality. It's quite easy for them to go and see a patient who is in the ward. And the German study, where there is less experience about NIV and the medical staff is not used to going and seeing patients in the wards, well, these are quite different studies, but we will be awaiting the results. Thank you for your attention.
Cet exposé